introduce our next two keynotes, I'd like to welcome Rosemary Banks, the chair of the New Zealand-US Council and former New Zealand ambassador to the US. Her distinguished diplomatic career includes roles as permanent representative to the UN in New York, ambassador to France and Portugal, and New Zealand's permanent representative to the OECD. She has also served as a Crown negotiator for the Treaty of Waitangi settlement process. Over to you, Rosemary.
Thank you, Sienna. Tēnā koutou katoa. We are so very fortunate to have with us for this afternoon's keynote session Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, Dan Kritenbrink. Dan is going to follow up on the central theme of our conference, Indo-Pacific, and what developments we can expect in our near-home region. Dan comes direct to us from Beijing, and he'll be addressing this question from the perspective of 30 years' experience in state and postings in Vietnam, Beijing, and Tokyo. And in his current role, I have to say, from the wonderful experience of working with Dan in Washington, that Dan has been one of the architects of the President Biden's deeper engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So, Dan, straight over to you. Thank you, and a welcome to New Zealand for the first time.
Thank you. Great to see you. Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Kia ora. It's such an honor to be here with you on my very first visit to New Zealand. You'll forgive me if I look slightly confused. I'm not sure exactly which country I'm in or which time zone, and I haven't slept much for the last week. But I always had a dream of coming to New Zealand. I had a geography professor who inspired me to pursue a career in international affairs, and he started his lecture on New Zealand by saying, if I had gone to New Zealand as a younger man, I would have never returned home. And so I had very high expectations, and I've only been on the ground 12 hours, but they've been met thus far. I want to first take a moment just to thank the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs for having me here today. I want to thank Executive Director Hamish McDougall, Chair Dick Grant, and everyone here. Thank you for the extremely important work that you do. Thanks for organizing this conference. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to be here. And oh, what a pleasure it is to see my good friend and world-class diplomat, Ambassador Rosemary Banks. Thank you. Ambassador Banks, I'm sure as all of you know, was such an outstanding representative of your country in Washington. Her wise counsel was sought out not just by myself, but by senior officials in the White House and Congress and many others. Rosemary, thank you for everything you've done for your great country, for our partnership. Thank you for introducing me here today. I'd also like to acknowledge Ngāti Whātua Oraki, the Tanga Whenua, for their stewardship of this land and for welcoming us here today. As Rosemary indicated, I've been asked to talk just a little bit about the U.S.-New Zealand partnership, so thank you for this opportunity. But I also want to share some thoughts on how I see New Zealand and the United States partnering together to bolster the regional and global rules-based international order against the many pressures that it faces today. President Biden and former Prime Minister Ardern noted at the White House last year that in the Indo-Pacific we face a challenging landscape where the values, norms, and rules that have fostered stability, growth, and prosperity in recent decades are under threat. They called for common purpose and action across the Atlantic and the Pacific to address these shared challenges. For both of our countries, changing geopolitical realities have helped to remind us who our friends are and to highlight the values that we share. Of course, nowhere is that more evident than in the strategic partnership between the United States and New Zealand, as expressed in the 2010 Wellington Declaration and the 2012 Washington Declaration. Now, the United States seeks to work with our partners and allies globally who share our vision of a world that's free, open, secure, and prosperous. And that vision is informed by our universal shared values of freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, as well as the ability to live in peace and security. That vision is clearly under threat in Europe, where the United States and New Zealand stand shoulder to shoulder in condemnation of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. I commend New Zealand's bold decision to pass autonomous sanctions legislation targeting Russia, acting to impose sanctions outside a UN mandate for the first time. That has enabled New Zealand to make common cause with the US, Australia, the UK, the EU, many other like-minded partners around this region and around the world to stand up for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And New Zealand has provided essential support for Ukraine as it fights for its freedom through contributions to the NATO Trust Fund, provision of imagery and technical assistance, and training of Ukrainian military personnel. And we welcome New Zealand's stepped-up cooperation with NATO, including former Prime Minister Ardern's attendance at last year's NATO summit. And while our partnership with New Zealand is certainly global, it is centered right here in the Indo-Pacific. The United States and New Zealand have collaborated to promote a free and open, prosperous, connected, secure, and resilient Indo-Pacific, based on a shared understanding that developments in one corner of this vast region can have dramatic impacts elsewhere, and on our shared belief that much of the history of the 21st century will be written in this vitally important region. This vision is reflected in both of our Indo-Pacific strategies, which we mutually support, and which demonstrates tremendous strategic convergence, not just between the US and New Zealand, but with our many like-minded partners worldwide. Now, America's primary focus in this region, as outlined in the White House's Indo-Pacific strategy, is to build our collective capacity with like-minded allies, partners, and friends. In fact, when I'm asked to distill into one line or one phrase American foreign policy, I say that it is allies, partners, and friends. America recognizes that we are stronger, more prosperous, and more secure when we have successful and strong like-minded partners around the world. We do this so that together we can advance shared priorities and bolster the global and rules-based order from which we have all benefited. And to do so, we have been building what we call a lattice work of relationships, formal and informal, bilateral and multilateral, to promote these shared goals. I think you've witnessed stepped-up U.S. diplomatic efforts across the region that have led to a revitalization of our treaty alliances and key partnerships, of course, including with New Zealand, as well as a strengthening of our relationships with regional institutions such as ASEAN and the Pacific Islands Forum, including at the U.S.-ASEAN and the U.S. Pacific Island Country Summits hosted by President Biden in Washington, D.C. last year. You've also seen our promotion of other formal and informal groupings to include the Quad, AUKUS, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and the partners in the Blue Pacific. It is our focus on building and strengthening our partnerships in this vitally important region that brings me here today. Now, of course, I think one cannot speak about the region without saying something about the People's Republic of China, so allow me to say a few words about our approach to the PRC. The Biden administration's approach to China, as laid out in Secretary Blinken's speech of March last year, and in the Biden administration's national security strategy, remains invest, align, and compete. We are investing in the foundations of American strength at home. We are aligning with partners and allies on our approach abroad. And we are harnessing those two key assets to compete with the PRC to defend our interests and build our vision for the future. At the same time, we remain open to exploring areas of cooperation with China where it is in our interest to do so. I arrived here in Auckland just last night, got to the hotel about midnight, went to bed about 2, and I come just on the heels of having concluded more than 8 hours on June 5 with my Chinese counterparts in Beijing. I can assure you that our talks with our Chinese counterparts were exceptionally candid, but they were also productive and constructive. We seek to keep open lines of communication and build on recent high-level diplomacy between our two countries. We exchange views on a wide range of issues, including the bilateral relationship, cross-strait issues, channels of communication, and other matters. But we also made clear that the United States would compete vigorously with China and that we will continue to stand up for our interests and our values. I also want to reassure you, though, that we do not seek conflict with China or a new Cold War. We are not trying to contain China. As I noted above, even as we compete, we will work to maintain open lines of communication so as to avoid miscalculation and to prevent competition from veering into conflict. The U.S. continues to have a robust trade and investment relationship with China, as do most of our partners and allies. We are, however, for de-risking and diversifying. We are not for decoupling. This means investing in our own capacities and in secure, resilient supply chains, pushing for a level playing field for our workers and companies, defending against harmful trade practices, and ensuring that U.S. and allied technology is not used against us. We're committed to working with allies and partners to advance a free and open Indo-Pacific, one that is at peace and grounded in respect for a rules-based international order, and to standing up to attempts by anyone to undermine that order. But in doing so, we do not ask partners to choose. Instead, we're working to ensure that our partners have choices and that they remain free to make their own sovereign decisions, free from coercion. Now, as we focus on promoting peace and prosperity across the region by strengthening our partnerships, nowhere has that work been more important or more evident than right here in the Pacific. As Pacific nations, I'm confident that the United States and New Zealand are working together to support the Pacific Islands and bolster Pacific regionalism with a strong Pacific Islands Forum at its center. We are extremely grateful to New Zealand, not just for its cooperation, but for its sound advice and wise counsel, and Rosemary knows exactly what I'm talking about, as we work together to promote our shared interests and values in this critical area. I will say thank God for New Zealand, thank God for our partnership with this wonderful country. The Pacific region connects the United States with the broader Indo-Pacific. And the nations and territories of the Pacific, they are our friends, they are our relatives, they are our close neighbors. 2 million American citizens call the Pacific Islands home. Millions of Pacific Islanders call America home. Now, we were extremely pleased just a couple of weeks ago when Prime Minister Hipkins was able to attend the U.S. Pacific Island Leaders Dialogue and met with Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Port Moresby. We thought that the Leaders Dialogue was an opportunity for productive discussion on our shared visions for the Pacific region, building upon our exchanges at the U.S. Pacific Island Summit in Washington, D.C. last September. And I think as you're all tracking, President Biden very much looks forward to welcoming Pacific Island leaders to Washington, D.C. Later this year for a follow-on summit. And might I say, even though I've only been in New Zealand for just a few hours, I was really inspired by Foreign Minister Mahuta's speech this morning. Again, I thought there was tremendous convergence and overlap in our approaches. I know that our New Zealand partners will make their own sovereign decisions about how they want to proceed, but again, I was moved by the incredible convergence in our approach. And might I say the same about Fijian Prime Minister Rambuka, who it was an honor to see him here again today. Was impressed by his opening remarks, and I had the opportunity to sit down briefly afterwards with both the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister. And again, I'm optimistic about our shared future together. Let me say just a little bit more about our work together with New Zealand. In an effort to align our engagement and respond to Pacific Island priorities, New Zealand and the United States are founding members of the Partners in the Blue Pacific, or the PBP, where we're working with a host of like-minded partners to do things such as deliver results for the Pacific more efficiently and effectively, in line with the Pacific Island Forum's own 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. We're also trying to bolster Pacific regionalism centered around the PIF. I'm sure you've noticed that America has deployed our first special envoy to the PIF, Ambassador Frankie Reed. We hope that's just one small manifestation of our commitment to PIF centrality. We're also working to expand opportunities for cooperation between the Pacific and the world. Partners in the Blue Pacific members have also engaged in high-level consultations with the Pacific Islands Forum on desired outcomes for the group, and the PBP is committed to coordinating closely with the PIF as the region's leading institution. There are other specific lines of effort that have emerged for the PBP, including Pacific humanitarian warehousing, so that we pre-position emergency and humanitarian supplies, as was agreed by PIF ministers at the inaugural Disaster Risk Reduction Ministers meeting in Nadi. We're looking forward to an annual Pacific Cyber Capacity Conference, to furthering support for the Pacific Climate Change Center in Samoa, and to supporting access to climate finance. We also continue to consult with the Pacific Island countries and the PIF on how the partners in the Blue Pacific can best support other regional priorities. In January, the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies hosted a PBP workshop to strengthen shared understanding among PBP members and the Pacific Islands on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing and maritime domain awareness. As maritime democracies, the United States and New Zealand are committed to supporting a freer and more open Pacific, and that depends again on preserving the international rules-based order, including in the maritime domain. Having hopefully set for you the regional context, let me now turn to a key, specific, and tangible reason that has brought me to your beautiful country tomorrow. I'm looking forward to discussing these and many other issues with my friend, the MFAT Chief Executive and Secretary Chris Seed, at our annual U.S.-New Zealand Strategic Dialogue. And if you'll indulge me, I'll give you just a few examples that demonstrate the breadth and depth of the U.S.-New Zealand bilateral strategic partnership. This year, our strategic dialogue will include a section on human rights and democracy, so we can better collaborate on gender equality, LGBTQI+ equality, and holding corrupt leaders accountable. Through the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse, the U.S. and New Zealand, along with 10 other member countries, continue working to address technology-facilitated gender-based violence through joint and regional efforts. Among the Global Partnership's efforts centered on policy programming and data, the U.S. and New Zealand will continue working together to strengthen the evidence base on technology-facilitated gender-based violence. Part of that work includes furthering research on linkages between online misogyny and terrorist and violent extremist content, which will be prioritized through continued collaboration between the Global Partnership and New Zealand's Christchurch Call. More broadly, together, the United States and New Zealand are investing in the strengthening of the foundations of freedom, openness, connectivity, prosperity, security, and resilience as we support the region's multilateral architecture. And we are building partnerships to tackle shared challenges in the face of powers that offer a competing vision of the world and regional order. In the economic sphere, New Zealand, the United States, and other like-minded partners are working together to advance regional prosperity and connectivity, including through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And New Zealand has also been a tremendous partner as we, the United States, prepare to host the APEC Economic Leaders Week in November. Collaboration between the United States and New Zealand also takes place in Christchurch, in Antarctica's Ross Sea, and in the Antarctic Treaty System. And this has taken on increased importance as there are more discussions about strategic competition in the region, and Arctic science improves our understanding of climate change without a doubt. In just a few short years, New Zealand has become a critical partner as well on space exploration, signing on to the Artemis Accords and concluding a bilateral space framework agreement. Rocket Lab, a company founded here in Auckland 17 years ago this month, is one terrific example of that cooperation with regular launches, often carrying U.S. government payloads, occurring both here in New Zealand and in California, and also from the state where I currently live, Virginia. We hope to build on that success through a new bilateral technology dialogue to stimulate new cooperation on emerging technologies. So let me say, in conclusion, I hope I've given you some insights into what we view as this incredibly consequential and strategic U.S.-New Zealand partnership. For 80 years, our partnership has benefited both our countries, the Pacific, the region, and the world. Today, we face a world that demands even closer cooperation and new resolve. As such, I believe that the United States and New Zealand will continue to stand together to advance our shared goals in the region, support the rules-based international order, and defend our shared democratic values and promotion of human rights. Together, I'm confident that the U.S. and New Zealand will meet the challenges of the 21st century. Thank you very much. Did you have a conversation? Wonderful. Please. Please.
Thank you very much, Dan. I think you've set out very clearly why the US remains such an essential strategic partner for New Zealand. We are under a little bit of time pressure. We've got the next keynote speaker beaming into us shortly, but one or two questions for Dan before we move on.
I also reserve the right you want me to stay here for the
You
questions?
stay here.
Okay.
Yes. Yep, we've got a question there.
I think Rosemary said I provide a more convenient target if I stay standing. So I'm going to stand right here. Why don't you yell your question and I'll repeat it here for everyone.
Oh,
There you go.
There we go.
There we go.
You said you just pulled in this morning. Where did you come from? Like, what country did you come from, and
Yep.
what were you doing there?
I was in Beijing. I went primarily to have conversations with my counterparts at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I did talk with some other people outside the government and with our world-class team at the embassy. But as I tried to indicate in my remarks, the United States has a very consequential but exceptionally complex relationship with the People's Republic of China. And I'm sure, just like other friends around the world, I could describe in great detail some of the challenges in that relationship and also some areas where we hope to cooperate. But no matter what happens between the United States and China, we are committed to keeping open channels of communication so that we can manage responsibly our increasing competition. That was my number one goal. I came away cautiously optimistic in our ability to do so. But I will say, I think the stakes are high and the challenges are significant, but we're committed to continuing to work at it. Thank you. Please. Okay. Please.
Thank you very much for your address.
Thank you.
My question sort of relates to US grand strategy in a way. I certainly applaud all of the bilateral and regional initiatives you're talking about and the partnerships you're building, but do you think US strategy really focuses on the maintenance of US primacy? Because that sort of worries me when I look at competition and the rise of very large powers who may be, confronting US primacy. And what is US grand strategic thinking in terms of accommodating the rise of very large powers? And do you think you can relinquish some of that kind of quest for preeminence, which we have benefited from? So I don't mean to ask this question as a critic, but rather to understand trajectory.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Look, when we discuss and debate internally, what should the focus of American foreign policy be? How should we grapple with strategic competition? How should we revitalize our alliances and partnerships around the world, Europe, Asia, and everywhere else? I don't know if I know too many people in the halls of American power who talk about trying to preserve American primacy, so to speak. What we talk about is that even today, more than 70 years since the end of World War II, we continue to believe that America is stronger and more prosperous when we are invested in the outside world, when we are invested in the success of partners and allies who, like us, believe in a rules-based international order, do not believe in the law of the jungle, and do not believe that might makes right. That is why I think Russia's unprovoked, brutal invasion of Ukraine poses such an existential threat, I think, to the entire rules-based international order. And it's why the United States, together with so many like-minded partners around the world, have stepped up to meet that challenge. I've often spoken at events to reflect a little bit some of the things that have been most prominent in my tenure as Assistant Secretary since September of 2021. One of the things that stands out the most is the amount of time that I and American diplomats have spent working with European partners on Asian security matters and working with Asian partners on European security matters, and I mean explicitly Ukraine. It's been striking how much New Zealand, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and many other partners have stood up to condemn Russia's actions and to take steps to impose costs on Russia for having done so, and hopefully send a message to other powers around the world that this kind of behavior is unacceptable. That's what animates American foreign policy. That's why when I try to distill into one phrase American foreign policy, I don't talk about primacy. I don't actually talk about us. I talk about investing in the collective capacity of our allies, partners, and friends. I think that if we do that, if we ensure that our partners around the world are successful and that we continue to work together to advance our interests and our values, then I'm very optimistic about our future. If every country in the world, including New Zealand, has the ability to make its own sovereign decisions free from coercion, every country, including New Zealand, has the ability and the right to succeed and to be prosperous and secure, then we'll all succeed. That, I think, is how I would define American foreign policy. Thank you. You want to do one more, or is that it?
I'm awfully sorry. I'm sure the room is full of questions for Dan, but we're going to have to move on.
We're just getting warmed up here.
So-
But Rosemary, thank you very much for having me. I'm so delighted to be here on what I hope will be just the first of many visits to New Zealand, and
I
it's
hope so
lovely
too.
to see you.
And
Thank you for everything.
Please thank Dan, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Sure.
See you
Thank you.
soon. Well, the conference organisers have really spoilt us today with two excellent keynote speakers this afternoon. So by magic, I hope now that Max Boot is going to be joined up with us by remote means. And while he joins us, Max, a big welcome. Max is a Senior Fellow for National Security at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the author of a number of very influential books, a leading authority on conflict, and a well-known commentator on media. So, Max, we know that your achievements are many. We've held you up, so I'm going to be very short and pass you straight over to you. Please, take us away. Thank you.
Great. Well, great to be with you. Good afternoon or good evening, as we say here in New York. It's a pleasure to be with you. I know time is brief, so I want to just jump to kind of the essentials and talk about the most important issues in the world. And I think most of us agree that the two most important issues in the world right now are the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the US-China rivalry. And so let me just very briefly talk about both of those things. I actually just got back from Kyiv a couple of weeks ago, and I was tremendously heartened to see the resolution of the Ukrainian people after more than a year of war. And it was really heartening to see that not only are they resolved to continue fighting and to kick the Russian invaders off their soil, but in large parts of Ukraine, life has really returned to more or less normal. Where in Kyiv, for example, where the stores are open, the restaurants are open, the population is almost at the same level as it was before the invasion. Everything seems very normal, except of course for the fact that they have nightly air raids. But mercifully, Ukraine is able to defend its cities now, thanks to the tremendous air defenses it has acquired from the West and to their tremendous skill in operating those air defenses. I think the issue now is obviously going to be the success or failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which seems to be in its very early stages as we speak. I think this is going to be a tremendously challenging task because it's always harder to attack than to defend, and the Ukrainians have to carry out the kind of fast-moving combined arms operations that the Russians completely failed to carry out last year. But I am just tremendously impressed by the Ukrainians, by their morale, by their fighting spirit, by their leadership, and so I think they have a very good chance to take back more territory from the Russians, and a very good chance in particular to break the land bridge between Crimea and Donbass. And if they can do that, it will deal a very serious blow to Vladimir Putin. That doesn't mean it's going to win the war, because Russia is a large country. They can continue fighting for a long time, but it will certainly bring home, I think, to Russian elites the reality that they are not winning the war. And I think, Putin's strategy, to the extent that he has one, has been to wait us out because he thinks that Russia has more staying power than Ukraine's backers around the world, including, of course, New Zealand. So far, Putin's bet has been wrong. Europe got through the winter. Europe has weaned itself off of Russian oil and gas. And I would say support for Ukraine is as high as it's ever been. In fact, Ukraine is now receiving equipment that it did not receive at the beginning of the war, including main battle tanks, including armored personnel carriers, including long-range cruise missiles being provided by the United Kingdom. So I am very heartened to see the combination of Ukrainian bravery and skill in fighting and the support that the free world has given them in their battle. And I trust and hope that support will continue until all of Ukraine's territory is liberated, which I believe to be a realistic objective, if not this year, then perhaps next year. Turning very quickly to the U.S.-China rivalry, that is of course, the other geopolitical flashpoint that has the potential to turn into an even worse war than the one that we are seeing in Ukraine. And I think that the challenge now is to avoid war with China, while at the same time trying to deter China from an attack on Taiwan, and also trying to curb China's attempts to exert power over the South China Sea and over its neighbors, much to the displeasure and concern of its many neighbors and other countries in the Asia-Pacific region. I think this is a very delicate task that has multiple components. In some ways, we're seeing a rerun of the Cold War, but in a very different situation where we have, China is the major trade partner for all of its neighbors and also for the United States, very different from the Soviet Union, with which we have very little economic relationship. So the challenge with China, I think, is to continue trading with China at the same time deter China, and striking that balance is very hard to do. I think President Biden is doing a reasonably good job, especially with mobilizing the Quad, concluding the AUKUS agreement with Australia, and also helping South Korea and Japan to overcome their differences and to strike a higher level of cooperation. And of course, Japan's decision to increase their defense spending and take off some of their self-imposed shackles, I think is huge and welcome news, similar to the way that NATO has been rearming since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So too now you're seeing Japan rearming as the threat from China increases. So I think those are very welcome signs. I do worry in managing the economic competition that sometimes we can tip over into protectionism, and sometimes I fear that the United States, under both Republicans and Democrats of late, has been pursuing a wholly negative trade policy where we're imposing sanctions on China, we're trying to limit exports of microchips to China, but we don't have a positive agenda to grow U.S. trade. And for example, the decision by President Trump to exit the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think, was a big mistake, but so too is the unwillingness of President Biden to re-enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which of course New Zealand and many of our other Asian Pacific partners and allies are a part of, and that's a way that we can grow all mutual economies and decrease our dependence on China. But standing in the way is this protectionism, which sadly has become the default mode on both the left and the right in the United States. I really think in the competition with both China and Russia, America's trump card, so to speak, is really our allies. And I personally, I know on my many past visits to Iraq and Afghanistan, I was very heartened to see Kiwis there, along with Aussies and so many other allies from all over the world, standing together shoulder to shoulder with the United States and trying to support freedom and democracy. And of course, that is happening today in Ukraine. It's certainly happening with China as well. And that's that is a core strength of ours that China and Russia cannot match because they have very few friends and they're trying to expand their own relationship, but they're also very wary of each other, and there are major strains in the Russia-China relationship despite their claims of limitless friendship. There are in fact sharp limits there, whereas we have, the United States has much truer, closer, and deeper ties with, especially with democratic allies in both Asia and Europe. But I think, if alliances are our strong suit, I think America's weak point, and something that allies have cause to be concerned about, is American politics. I mean, it's hard to forget what happened under Donald Trump, who really tried to turn back many decades of American foreign policy centered on American global leadership, on American security alliances, on free trade. He was opposed to all those things and tried to unravel them. And he would go even further, I think, in doing greater damage to the American-led global system if he manages to come back into office. I'm also concerned about Ron DeSantis, who seems to be imitating some of Donald Trump's protectionist and isolationist foreign policies. And unfortunately, if you look at the public opinion polls, Joe Biden is not a shoo-in for re-election. He's actually running pretty much neck and neck with Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. So I think, we have to be very concerned about the possibility of a neo-isolationist president taking power in the United States, because if the United States does not stand up for freedom, a lot of our allies are doomed, starting with Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to last 5 minutes without American support, and sadly, I think that is what Putin is counting on. I think Putin may well hold out hope that the 2024 election will bring Trump to office, and that will allow him to escape the terrible military disaster into which he has led his country. So, I wish, I'm pretty confident in the leadership that Joe Biden is providing right now. I think he's done a great job of assembling this coalition to check Russian aggression. I think he's doing a pretty good job of assembling another overlapping coalition to check Chinese aggression. But I do worry about whether the United States will continue to pursue relatively centrist, sensible policies like those of the Biden administration, because I'm cognizant of the power of the extremes in American politics, and especially the power of the far right, which has taken over the Republican Party, my former party, and could well return to power in general in 2024. So that's, I think, the United States and our democratic allies have the power and the potential, I think, to deal with all the threats that we face, whether it's China or Russia or Iran, North Korea. Those are all major challenges. I think we can deal with them, but the key is, I think, the world needs American leadership. America is the most powerful democracy, has to be in front. And unfortunately, I think support for international leadership is more under threat today than it has been at any point in the past 70 years. So in some ways, I think, what happens in America in the next couple of years in our politics will have a huge and disproportionate impact on geopolitics in both Europe and Asia. All I can say as an American is, I hope we don't let New Zealand and our many other allies down. We haven't so far. We certainly have not over the past 70 years, but I think what's happened in the last few years in the United States has to give any reasonable observer of American politics great cause for concern. So with that, let me. I know we're pressed for time, so I want to end my remarks, and maybe we have a minute or two for questions.
Max, thank you very, very much. There's a lot of sober and somber, thought-provoking comments made there. I have very strict and brutal instructions as a moderator to accept only one question, so I'm going to give priority to the first person I see.
It's got to be a good one now.
Okay, there you go. Hang on. No.
Everyone needs a Suze. Max, my question is, you've written a lot about sanctions and their ineffectiveness. In this age of impunity where it's very hard to hold the autocrats and the breakers of law, international law, accountable. We've just seen Russia chair the Security Council while waging an illegal war. If not sanctions, what? And the second question around that is, how do we reform the multilateral system that is clearly so wanting? Easy.
Okay, well, I hope you got more than 30 seconds for an answer. I'm actually not sure I have a good answer to either question. Those are tough ones. I mean, I think the reason why we increasingly resort to sanctions is because it seems like the easiest policy to follow. But, you know, sanctions themselves have gotten out of control. As I just wrote, we've seen a 900% increase in the use of sanctions by the United States, so that right now the U.S. is sanctioning nearly 12,000 entities. And, you know, in a lot of cases, we're channeling moral outrage, but we're not getting a lot done. I mean, think about all these countries that have been under U.S. sanctions for years: Iran or North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba. And Cuba's been under U.S. sanctions since like 1960. And what has that actually achieved? Not very much. I mean, that's not an argument for lifting sanctions, but I think it is an argument for being more strategic in their applications. And yeah, actually, with those sanctions on Cuba, I mean, that doesn't make any sense. You know, there are clearly situations like Russia where we do need to impose sanctions, but we also need to recognize that sometimes they can backfire, and sometimes they're imposing huge costs on innocent people who have no say in the government's policies, but are not actually changing those governments' behaviors, and sometimes they can backfire. And there was a good example of that just this past weekend at the Shangri-La Dialogue, where U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin wanted to meet the Chinese defense minister, but the Chinese defense minister did not want to meet with Secretary Austin because guess what? The Chinese defense minister is under U.S. sanctions because of his role in buying equipment from Russia in 2018. That doesn't make any sense. Those sanctions are not stopping China from buying Russian equipment, but they are stopping the Chinese military from talking with the U.S. military. And we need to be talking because we just had two near collisions, one in the air, one at sea. It is vitally important that those militaries establish lines of dialogue, and having these silly symbolic sanctions on the Chinese defense minister is an obstacle to that. So we ought to be smarter and more strategic and lift sanctions like those that make no sense, while of course trying to impose sanctions that will limit, for example, Russia's war-making potential.
Well, it was a one good question, and it was a very good last answer. So, Max, thank you very much. We hope another time we'll have more time to get your observations. Much appreciated. Thanks, Max, everybody. Right.